Boris, we are here again at the Spinnaker Summit.
Yes, the first real Spinnaker Summit.
The first real.
Yeah.
So what role has Mirantis played in this summit?
Well, we are the highest level sponsor. I mean, there's the diamond sponsor, which is Netflix, and they basically put on the show, but we are the highest level sponsor. We basically worked very closely with the Netflix team on actually, figuring out components of the agenda. We have multiple talks here. I'm going to be doing a keynote tomorrow on, the possibility of Spinnaker becoming a standard for continuous delivery, much like Kubernetes is a standard for container scheduling. We, since we've talked, actually launched Spinnaker training certification. And actually the big focus for us in this summit is promoting that training certification. We believe that, open source projects follow a certain adoption curve, and Spinnaker is still kind of, at a place where there's a few power users, but most users are kind of trying to evangelize Spinnaker in their organization, try to get the broader organizational buy-in, try to get more development teams to use it. And things like training certification is a way to actually help accelerate that. So we are investing in that heavily. But that's us at the summit.
Right. We talked last time, I think we have talked about Spinnaker a couple of times. So where is Spinnaker community today?
The community is growing. If you look at just the dynamic of the Spinnaker Slack channel, which Andy likes to talk about, and I think with, early projects, looking at things like that is one of the ways to actually measure the project velocity. So he mentioned there is like 5,400 or something like that active users in the Spinnaker Slack channel, but most importantly, the growth, right? And who is there, that I think is important to pay attention to. So it's adding probably like 100, 150 new people that are coming into the channel because they want to kind of start interacting with the community every month, right? So it's a substantial growth. The I think interesting aspect, and it's kind of like a double-edged sword of who are the people that are coming into the Spinnaker community, who are the people that are participating in the Slack channel. So if you look at, for instance, like the history of OpenStack, it was mostly during the initial wave of growth, very vendor dominated. There's a lot of vendors and there's people from all kinds of big companies sitting. So the Spinnaker is actually kind of like almost an overcorrection in the opposite direction, where it's very heavily user dominated. So most of the people in the Spinnaker Slack channel are actually users that are doing something with Spinnaker. And, the common wisdom is like, oh, it's great because there's adoption there and there's a lot of users, but I think that for any open source community to really be healthy and to thrive, there has to be a certain balance between vendors and users. And users indication of adoption, and users actually help kind of define the roadmap in terms of real problems that exist within the platform architecture. But the vendors are the ones that are able to take on kind of a longer term, bigger strategic problems. So if I'm, like a user of Spinnaker, like Salesforce, for instance, and I have a problem with, the architecture and the different services being too chatty, like you need to do a lot of work to solve that problem. I can maybe like make a plugin or write a patch if I'm a user, but I'm not going to invest into like a 15, 20 person team and pool a large kind of a rewrite or re-architecture initiative, right? So the vendors can typically take care of the longer term roadmap items. And I think that the user part is really kind of solved in the Spinnaker context, and there's a lot of contributions, but the vendor part, it's like just Google and Netflix for the most part, other people contributing. So I think that the next wave of growth for the community has to be, various vendors also investing and backing the community with, teams, resources that can work on solving some of these bigger problems.
So what is the reason that the Spinnaker community is so different from, let's say, OpenStack community? the balance between the vendor versus the users?
Yeah, it has to do with just the history of how the community has evolved and how the community has been kind of advertised and promoted. So OpenStack community almost kind of started as an answer to the lack of open source cloud standard that they could sell. So Amazon was taking over the world, everybody wanted cloud, everybody wanted private cloud, they were coming to their vendor of choice. I work with Cisco, or I work with HP, or I work with Oracle, and they're like, okay, give me an alternative that is in my data center. And they're like, well, we don't have it. And then when OpenStack was born, all of the vendors just swarmed and said, oh, that's it, now we have a standard for it. And they started investing in it, and it was very heavily vendor dominated, whereas the user base kind of tagged along and started growing later, right? And there's a foundation around it right away. Now, if you look at the evolution of Spinnaker, it was, written by a user effectively to solve their specific problem, Netflix, and they kind of open sourced it just because, to show how cool Netflix is and for recruiting purposes. There was no plan really to actually grow a real community or make it something that vendors would take advantage of. And they've been running like that for several years, right? So it was very closed, just Netflix, and then Google joined later. And most of the people that actually comprise the community are not the ones that were taking it and trying to sell it. They're the ones that Netflix is doing it, so I'll take it and I'll also use it for my own internal needs. So the user community kind of grew, but there was no formal governance and no foundation and no promotion and no vendor involvement. So it overgrew this kind of a user part of the community with fairly little vendor involvement.
And it has also something to do with that there was already a big challenge for the continuous delivery, and suddenly they had a solution which was already being used, not in case of OpenStack or the community which is being developed, it was already used internally.
So you're talking about for the users?
For users, so because they are looking at a technology which has already proven itself. It's not like they're starting something from the ground up.
Yes. And I think a lot of it also was not even so much like, let me build a continuous delivery thing internally. It's more like, what are the best practices for going to public cloud? That was the main driver, because Netflix is famous for being the guys that were the first ones to go all in on public cloud, and specifically Amazon. Right, so and the guys that were following were like, okay, well, how do we do that? How do we replicate that success? How do we deploy to cloud? And as this initiative starts, we're like, oh, well, Netflix is doing Spinnaker, well, let me do Spinnaker too. And that actually fueled a lot of the adoption among the users.
Right. So can it be seen as the answer to the continuous delivery problem that we are facing, or we are still?
Well, so, I wouldn't say that there is like a continuous delivery problem out there.
Right.
There is, an evolving pattern where companies are starting to, adopt and starting to kind of, continuously deliver their products. So it's like a new way of basically building software. And it's not like there's a problem with continuous delivery. There's a problem with it being early, and it's also being very heavily dominated by DIY solutions and being very fragmented. And I think that what Spinnaker brings to the table is a way to kind of consolidate the market around a single best practice, a single answer, kind of a standard for how you do continuous delivery. So yeah, I mean, that's basically it. And then the concern that I have is kind of like OpenStack was very quick to solve the private cloud problem, right? But when it comes to continuous delivery, it's higher up the stack, and the DIY solutions are more sticky, because when you get higher up the stack, there is value, of course, in Spinnaker's technology, but there's also a lot of value in the best practices and the business process that you as a company have encoded into your DIY solution, right? And because it's so tightly connected to like the business process, it's not very easy to go ahead and replace, Jenkins plus DIY with Spinnaker. And ultimately, I think that is going to happen. The question is, how long is it going to take, and how fast can something like Spinnaker displace a lot of the DIY that's out there for doing continuous delivery.
So what is the biggest hurdle customer or users face when they adopt and embrace Spinnaker?
It's first of all, there's a bunch of stuff which is typical of any new community that is not specific to Spinnaker, like lack of resources. There is no single way for getting Spinnaker deployed, or one prescribed way for doing Spinnaker HA. So people kind of coming in and they're learning and experimenting, and some experiments actually fail, and to make them more successful they need more expertise, so they try to find people that know how to do Spinnaker, and there's not that many of them. So all of this kind of a standard early adoption hurdles. And also I think there are a few kind of a fundamental problems with the Spinnaker architecture that kind of need to, over time, evolve away. Let's put it this way. One of the biggest is, the issue of, how easy it is to plug it in to something, right? So the issue of pluggability with Spinnaker. So on the positive side, everybody in the community, if you hear like Andy Glover talk, he says that pluggability is paramount. That's, one of the core tenets. But because it evolved as like a Netflix-centric tool to solve their specific problem, they never really thought about building like a very reusable, pluggable framework. So when we're talking about writing a plugin for Spinnaker, like if I want to plug into my like database backend, or I want to write a new custom deployment stage, or very common is that like I want it to work with Amazon EKS rather than EC2 or some other cloud service. What that means is that you actually need to like fork the code. You need to go in and change the code and some of the components with a lot of dependencies, including changes to the UI, to make that work, and then you merge the code back. You can't actually create a new repo and just write a plugin following specific set of rules that talks to a specific limited set of APIs and just plop it there and make it work. It's really actually like changing the core code of the platform, right? And I think that this concept of pluggability is paramount to the success and growth of any open source community, and particularly to open source community that is in the CD space. And as we've kind of delved into the Spinnaker world, this has been the number one problem with our customers, because every customer has a slightly different, deployment target, slightly different set of things that need to interface with a continuous delivery tool. And being able to do it very quickly and seamlessly, write all these plugins, is very important. And I think that Spinnaker community could do probably, some important work on evolving Spinnaker's architecture towards being more plugin friendly.
Right. And when we talk about Spinnaker community, have you finalized any governance model around it yet?
So you probably saw that Andy has announced just at his keynote this morning the first kind of draft of a governance model that's been adopted, which is a huge leap forward. If you remember, we talked 6 months ago, was it at KubeCon, and I was talking about that potentially becoming the next important thing for them. So today there is, if before I'm a contributor, I have to basically know Stephen Kim or Andy Glover, or go make some friends in a Slack channel, how do you become a committer, how do you contribute? There's no way to do it. Now they've actually formalized that it's not very detailed, kind of, very in-depth, fully thought out kind of a, governance model, but it is way better than the complete lack of it. So there is a formal, like a wiki page that describes what you need to do to become a committer, how you merge, etc. So I think it's very important that's what's happening. I think that the next happening is this needs to evolve further as people start contributing. There's going to be a lot of edge questions, like if I'm writing a plugin and I wrote a load of code, can I merge that? Like there has to be some kind of, kinks worked out along the way. And I also think that, the next step would be for Spinnaker to be donated to some foundation that can actually take it on its own kind of independent path, which will actually help bring, I think, more vendors that can take and then solve big problems in the Spinnaker community, like, for example, the lack of the plugin framework. So, like OpenStack Foundation or CNCF or Apache Foundation, whatever it is, I think is going to be a big important step towards taking the community development to the next level.
Since Google is already involved with this project, and Google also has Kubernetes, and there are always parallels drawn between Kubernetes and Spinnaker, even the keynote, Spinnaker is becoming. So can you talk about that?
Yeah, so it's one of the things that, of course, because Kubernetes is like the hottest thing since sliced bread now, everybody wants Kubernetes. A lot of the greenfield activities in the infrastructure space are tied to Kubernetes. And the Kubernetes team is, able to make a lot of decisions and influence the direction, right? So if I'm going to cloud, typically Kubernetes is there because that's my way to do, multi-cloud with no lock-in. If I'm moving to containers and re-architecting my applications, that's Kubernetes is there. If I'm trying to adopt DevOps, Kubernetes is there. There's always a Kubernetes team. And that Kubernetes team has a lot of influence over what tools are used. Is Spinnaker used? Is something else used in the context of the overall initiative? And if you look at a lot of the talks that are happening today and tomorrow, as well as what the community is working on, there is a lot of work being done to make Spinnaker Kubernetes friendly. They had the V1 provider, now they just released the V2 provider. People are trying to use it, yada yada. But I think that if you go to like KubeCon and you talk to the Kubernetes developers, and very few people have actually heard of Spinnaker or are choosing proactively to use Spinnaker as their way to do continuous delivery into Kubernetes. And the reason for it is twofold. One is simply because of lack of the marketing aspect. It's not part of the foundation. It's still it's very promising, but a smaller project that a lot of people outside of this continuous delivery domain, such as Kubernetes people, haven't heard about. But two, very importantly, is also the fact that Spinnaker was never really built, in my view, with a developer in mind. It was built as a tool for the ops team to manage the delivery process. And in a DevOps equation, the dev part is kind of carrying more and more weight. And I don't think that any tool, any DevOps tool, be it continuous delivery tool or CI tool or whatever, that wants to be a player in the space can be exclusively focused just on the ops. It has to be also developer friendly. And the way Spinnaker is built, it's pretty big, it's pretty heavy. It takes some effort to actually set it up, install it. And if I'm a developer hacking on Kubernetes, I'm not going to go and, take this, big hunk of Java code that is Spinnaker and go set it up on, several VMs. I can't. It's even virtually impossible to set it up on a laptop, even, right? So I think that's another important area for Spinnaker community to tackle, right? So I think it's absolutely important for Spinnaker to be relevant to Kubernetes developers, and it's also completely clear that in its current shape or form as this heavy Java-based tool, as a developer, I'm not going to go and play around with it and then go and sell it to my boss and say, oh yeah, that's the best tool to deploy on Kubernetes. And in parallel, Kubernetes is also actually deploying its native tools for doing Kubernetes deployments. There's this Kubernetes, stateful sets. There's a deployment object now where you can actually define how the deployment is done for Kubernetes. So the Kubernetes community is evolving and building its own Kubernetes-centric deployment patterns. I think that it's important that in the next couple of years or a year, Spinnaker really bridges into the Kubernetes community, or it risks Kubernetes evolving away on its own path, and then it's not going to be good.